What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel. It's been a while. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're talking XFL DFS. We are beginning our journey. Well, kind of, it's the reboot of the XFL, but we'll be talking all things DFS. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. If you're listening on podcast, please leave a rating and review over there as well. If you're watching, we are presented by Prize Picks. You can see that on the screen in the banner, and they have a phenomenal offer for you guys. A first match deposit bonus up to $100. That is available in the link in the description below, or you can head over to Prize Picks. But if you click the link, that'll let them know that we sent you there. You can also get a free month of Stochastic and up to a $100 match deposit bonus when you click the link in the video description below. So make sure to take advantage of that. And they do have XFL. Now, it's week 1, and I can't come on this show with any amount of confidence and tell you I know the workloads of these players. So we will not be going through the individual picks. It is just guesswork, in my opinion. But we'll be doing just that in terms of this video, talking the DFS slate. First things first, it is week 1. There are a lot of coaching staffs in this league that are entirely unproven. It is a lot of guesswork. But with that said, we can make some educated guesses. So the structure is going to be game by game, and within each game, we're going to go team by team. And it's kind of a fluid structure. We'll be figuring things out as we go. But excuse me, we'll bring you over to DraftKings to start this out. And yeah, you guys get to see my DraftKings account because I don't have anything else to show you. So congratulations. First thing, let me scroll up a little bit so we can see the teams. There we go. It looks a little bit better. So first things first, we have Vegas taking on Arlington. We're going to talk about the coaches and then the viable plays from each team. So let's start with the Vegas side. This is a game that has moved a little bit in terms of line movement. Money's coming on the under, which is 36.5. That's actually one of the higher numbers on this slate. And Arlington is favored by 3.5 points. When we look to the Vegas side of things, I'll read my notes for each coaching staff and then try to talk about the individual players here. So Vegas is coached by Rod Woodson. A lot of you may know him as the former Raiders cornerback. Excuse me, the former DB. He coached for the Raiders. He played for them too, but he's a completely unknown coach for the most part, has not done anything other than the position level in his actual coaching career at any sort of premier level. His OC is Dwayne Taylor, who was the Alabama A&M OC, and their most recent season he was there, they finished with a 4-7 record. He's had pass rates all over the board. Most recent season, it was at 45%. The year prior to that, it was at 57%. So I think our best guess here is we're probably looking at a league average team in terms of pass rate is what I'm expecting here for the Vegas Vipers. But we will see. This is kind of one that is going to be a little bit more difficult to decipher. So on DraftKings, let's go to the quarterback position for this team. We'll just isolate that. A lot of people thought Brett Hundley would be the starter, but a lot of that because he's being paid more than any other player in this league, essentially. But they named Luis Perez the starter. Luis Perez has his roots all the way back to the AAF days. He played for Texas A&M Commerce. He's a pocket statue with really middling numbers overall in terms of what he offers as a passer. He doesn't run whatsoever. You're talking about a really low upside option, and I'm not entirely convinced he plays all his snaps. And that's something that's probably going to be a theme for some of these teams. We just don't know how much they're actually going to use these players. And Luis Perez is the definition of a game manager, even by XFL standards. He's pretty cheap in pricing, and he's not going to be owned. But having seen him play in numerous developmental leagues, it's very hard for me to click his name. At running back, we have Rod Smith, John Lovett, and DeAndre Torrey. So these teams all put out depth charts, and the lead back was Rod Smith, which was kind of counterintuitive. They spent more capital on John Lovett and DeAndre Torrey. DeAndre Torrey is a small North Texas product. He profiles more as your pass catching back. John Lovett spent time at both Baylor and Penn State, and he was actually used as a fullback a little bit at times. So he's more of your bigger back. All this to say, we're probably looking at some sort of committee between these players. seeing Rod Smith lead the way on the depth chart was very surprising here, but these are all going to be players that are relatively unowned and players I think you can click on for GPPs, but I have no confidence. I would, again, rank them just in order of the depth chart: Rod Smith, John Levitt, and DeAndre Torrey. But when we get to receiver, this is where we actually have some players that I think could provide us value. Unfortunately, it's Luis Perez delivering them the ball, but their receiving core on paper is one of the best in the XFL. Martavis Bryant, many of you know him from his days as a Pittsburgh Steeler. Jeff Badette and Geronimo Allison round out the three starting receivers that are expected. Those were the three listed starters on the depth chart for this team. And I think right away, Martavis Bryant is going to be among the most owned receivers in this league. I think only Josh Gordon probably has more ownership than him. And for a player who hasn't touched the football field in multiple years now, it's hard for me to click his name at the expected heavy ownership he'll be garnering. And I think Geronimo Allison is probably going to be the same or similar. Former Green Bay Packer, spent some time with the Detroit Lions. He's another guy here at 7K who I think players are probably going to pick on. The third starting receiver, Jeff Badette, he had one catch with the USFL last year. He's been highly drafted in all of these developmental leagues, like a really fast player, even going back to his time at college, which I believe was Oklahoma. Fact check me in the comment section if I'm wrong. He's actually just never put it on the field. And having seen him struggle even in these developmental situations, I would just rather go down and pay for Geronimo Allison if I'm doing that. And again, we don't know how many of these receivers are going to rotate on the field. They only have they only have 5 on this team. Behind him, they have Matthew Sexton, who's an Eastern Michigan product, if I'm not mistaken, and Sink Sweeting, who I've never heard of, but those two were listed as clear backups. They have 4 tight ends on the roster, which again points to this team being balanced and maybe a little run heavier. The names there are Brandon Dillon, Sean Price, Cam Sutton, and Travis Kuntz. The projected starter on this team is Brandon Dillon. There's not really much to write home about. So to sum up Vegas, I think the top players you're looking at are the receivers, Martavis Bryant, Geronimo Allison. And I think those 2 players are going to be pretty owned on the slate. And then from there, you could take a shot on like a John Lovett, potentially, or Rod Smith, but pretty lackluster situation. The next team is Arlington. And this team has the highest implied team total on the slate. As far as coaching staff and what we're expecting from Arlington, this is a difficult one to kind of parse out here, as they all are. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through my notes to find the right team. Okay, this one is particularly weird. Bob Stoops is the coach. He's back after an awful run in the first rendition of the XFL. He was the Dallas Renegades coach, and that team went 2-3. He also was the interim coach for Oklahoma in 2021 after Lincoln Riley left. His kid was on that team. Scored a touchdown in that game. Now, the original Dallas Renegades team was pretty pass heavy, but he went out and he brought in Jonathan Hayes and Chuck Long as co-offensive coordinators. Those two both were with the St. Louis BattleHawks previously, and that was a very run-heavy team. So this is one I think that's really push and pull here. You can go back to Stoops' time with Oklahoma, and he had pass rates kind of all over the board. In the most recent season, it was about 40%, 45% the year before that. And with the ties to the BattleHawks, I think this is probably going to be a balanced to run-heavy team. This is potentially a leverage point because some people in the industry think Arlington's going to be pass-heavy. I could see it going either way, honestly, and I'm willing to see that. Maybe they are a little pass-heavier than I think, but with the BattleHawks ties and Bob Stoops being wildly all over the board with his pass rate in the past, I'm not confident. And the problem here at quarterback, where you're starting to see these players in the spring, Kyle Sloter and Drew Plitt, they had an interesting quote. The staff said Drew Plitt is going to take the first bite of the apple or something stupid like that. But that suggests to me we probably see 2 guys on the field for this team. Kyle Sloter, USFL veteran, he was awful in that league. And you might hear some people hyping him up. He had as many interceptions as touchdowns. That team just threw a lot. Drew Plitt went to Ball State, if I'm not mistaken. So we're talking about really low-level college competition. He played in the MAC, pocket statue. Neither of these guys run the ball. And I think there's a chance that these players maybe come in a little overowned based on people hyping up this offense as a pass-heavy attack. And I don't necessarily believe that is the case. Could be. We will see. Again, we're talking largely in unknowns here. The running back position from this team, Again, this is pretty dicey overall, but they have Devion Smith, who they signed late, Keith Ford, and Adrian Killens on the roster right now. They listed Devion Smith and Keith Ford as co-starters. They actually gave them the OR tag. So this is one where I'm not really trying to take any stabs on this backfield. It is very clear, like most of the other situations could be a timeshare. We're not sure. Like Vegas could be a timeshare. We don't know. I think the OR tag on the running back field here pretty clearly designates these guys are going to be in a timeshare to some degree. And, neither of them were even brought in highly on this team. Like their draft picks were Keith Ford was the highest one that they still have left. But Demontre Tuggle, their second round pick, they cut. So we're not talking about the most talented roster in the league here at running back. This is probably a fade for me across the board. At receiver, for this team, the starters were listed Jordan Smallwood, Brandon Arconato, and Rennell Hall. So Jordan Smallwood went to Oklahoma. Brandon Arconato went to Washington State. He played in the Mike Leach system. And I don't know anything about Rennell Hall, but they also have some pretty interesting backups. Luwan Whittingham, I think, plays some snaps for this team. He spent a lot of time in the preseason with the Jaguars, was semi-close to making their roster. Sean Mobster, he's a Boise State product, not really much to see there. And Tyler Vaughns, he's a USC product there. They actually have a pretty talented receiving core, and I think there's a chance that this is more of a rotation than people are anticipating. And that's not even bringing up their tight end, Sal Cannella, who can be played at wide receiver as well. They use this wide receiver / tight end designation here. Cannella was their first-round draft pick. This is a guy that had an over 20% target share with his team in the USFL. He was actually brought up by the Green Bay Packers in the preseason for a little bit, played at Auburn. We're talking about like a borderline NFL talent here, like a practice squad caliber talent. I think there's a chance he's just the number one pass catcher on this team. Like Smallwood, Brandon Arconato, Rennell Hall. Only Luwan Whittingham has spent like really considerable time in the NFL to the same degree that Cannella has. So if I'm targeting two players on this team, it's going to be number one, Cannella. And then honestly, from number two there, just looking at the pricing between Smallwood, Arconato, and Rennell Hall's not even in the player pool, just for reference here. He's the third listed starter. Arconato is really cheap at $4,700. Again, the price difference there is not much, and I think this is probably a balanced team. Cannella and Arconato probably have decent ownership as well. Some of the premier, providers of content are hyping up Arconato for some reason. I'm not sure why. Just picking names out of a hat, I guess. But that's our first game. We'll go to the second one now. Orlando taking on Houston. And leave comments as well. Let me know what you think about the structure of the video. Again, I don't really have anything to show you in the background other than DraftKings, but feedback is much appreciated. Next week, we'll have a ton more data, of course, as well, which will help us here. All right. Going to Orlando, taking on Houston. This game is 35.5 points in terms of total. Houston, 3.5-point favorites here as well. They're tied for the second highest implied team total on the slate. They're a half point behind Arlington. They're tied with St. Louis. So Orlando coming in at 16 points. They're actually the lowest implied team on the slate. And this team is a complete disaster from a DFS perspective. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on Orlando. Their head coach is Terrell Buckley. He's a former NFL corner. He last played with the Giants in 2005. He's been a coach since then. He most recently coached corners for Ole Miss, previously coached at Mississippi State, but he's only been a position coach. Their OC is Robert Ford, who's a 71-year-old man and hasn't coached since 2011. He's also never been a coordinator, only been a position coach. And I don't think these guys actually know what they're doing. There was a quote from the team that said they couldn't see a reason why they wouldn't play three quarterbacks. Those players are Paxton Lynch, DeAndre Francois, and Quentin Dormady. Dormady went to Central Michigan. Francois, Florida State. Lynch, of course, Memphis. Lynch spent the most time in the NFL. But if it's going to be a three-way timeshare, I think you just X out the situation. And as far as pass rate, we have no idea. Ford was previously a wide receiver coach. Maybe that tilts this slightly more towards pass heaviness. But they don't really have the most dynamic pocket passers either in this league. So I'm tending to believe it's balanced. At running back, this is a spot where you're going to see a ton of ownership on John Martin. That's because they sent Devin Darrington to injured reserve, and they had to bring up another back earlier this week. So that name is, he's not in the player pool, but that is, it's not on my notes. I have to go to the projections. Kelvin Taylor. He was previously with the team. Kelvin Taylor will be backing up Jermaine Martin. But again, he's only been practicing with the team for a short period of time now. I think Jermaine Martin projects just on paper for the best workload in the XFL. So if you're playing one back in cash, it's probably Jermaine Martin. And then from there, we can look at receivers, tight ends. Again, I don't think this team is going to be anything too pass heavy. I'm projecting balanced play overall. But when we look at this team in the draft, they spent their first, second, and third round pick on wide receivers. Their fourth round pick was a tight end. And then they went to running back with Jermaine Martin in the fifth round. Their first receivers were Charleston Rambo, Andrew Jamiel, and Stephen Guidry. But their depth chart has since changed, and we have Cody Latimer listed among the starters instead of Andrew Jamiel. So the starters right now are Rambo, Guidry, and Latimer, who is also listed as a tight end on the site for a period of time, which is an interesting note here. Their tight end, Logan Carter, his backup is Ryan Becker. The backup to Cody Latimer is also Ryan Becker. So I think they plan on using Cody Latimer as a move tight end, which is really interesting to see. There's a lot of push and pull here, evidence that maybe they're run heavy, evidence that they're pass heavy. Again, I'm going to lean on them being balanced. Among the starters at receiver, Latimer is by far the cheapest and spent some time with the Denver Broncos in the preseason. Guidry is a product of Mississippi State, not really anything to write home about as a producer. And Charleston Rambo played at Miami and Oklahoma. A lot of hype on him as like a high schooler who never quite lived up to it in college. The most talented of these players is Cody Latimer. He's a little bit older. They also have Eli Rogers, Javonte Payton, Dontez Byrd, and Andrew Jamiel behind them. They were all listed as co-backups. So I think this is also a very risky situation where maybe we see these players split a little more time than we think. So preferred play for me is going to be Latimer on this team at 3K. Saves you a lot of salary. Don't anticipate a lot of ownership on him. I think most of the ownership from this team comes straight from Jermaine Martin at running back. Going to Houston, we'll start with quarterback. I think this team is going to be pretty popular just for reference. Going to check the stream. So I'm doing this by myself. Make sure everything looks good. It does. Sick. Going to Houston. This team is one I think we can get excited about for DFS specifically. So looking at the coaching staff, we have Wade Phillips. I think he's just the best overall coach, at least the one with like the most pedigree. He was the defensive coordinator for the Rams. He's just old now. His offensive coordinator is AJ Smith. He was a QB and wide receiver coach previously with the Houston Roughnecks. That team was awesome. They were 5-0, and they were a pass-heavy team and a spread offense, which I think is going to be the case here, which makes their listed starter, Brandon Silvers, pretty interesting for DFS. I think right away he's the best price-adjusted quarterback. Now, salary is not really a concern. You can do whatever you want with it. And Silvers doesn't really offer you anything as a rusher. He's also been in these developmental leagues, and he hasn't really been anything to write home about. But he is the quarterback of what looks like at least the most potent offense on paper, not just from a talent standpoint, but I think they're going to be very pass-heavy and run a lot of four-wide stuff. So Silvers immediately should be a consideration. I think he's a borderline cash play. It's probably between him and a couple other guys we'll talk about. At running back, if you weren't convinced of the pass-heavy nature of this team, they went out and they spent all their premier draft capital and their free agent stuff on pass-catching backs. So their number one listed running back is Max Borghi at 4,500. I think probably your two cash backs are Jermaine Martin and Max Borghi. Max Borghi played at Washington State. If I were to characterize him, he would be the poorest of Christian McCaffrey clones. And that goes all the way back to the college production. He was in that Mike Leach offense at Washington State. Hung on the Colts roster for a brief period of time, but he's been bouncing around NFL practice squads in the preseason. So we're talking about a really low-level talent here. But he has really good hands. From there, I think he probably has most of the work, but their backup was Bryson Aline. He's 3K flat. So if you do think this is any sort of timeshare, which there's been no indication one way or the other, Aline would be a good leverage play. Not really any information on him. Nick Holley's also on the roster. He spent some time in developmental leagues so far as well. But with the pass-heavy nature of this team, we want to take shots on the receivers as well. So this is a really fun team to target for receivers. They actually only have one tight end on the roster. That's Garrett Owens. But all that to say, I think they're going to be running four wide quite a bit here. Their top 3 receivers on the depth chart were Cedric Byrd, product of Hawaii. He was in that run and shoot offense there that ran 4 wide, so he knows the scheme. Deontay Burnett, product of USC, had a cup of coffee in the NFL. And Justin Smith, who I'm not familiar with. Behind them, they have Jontre Kirkland. He's an LSU product. Travell Harris, who I believe went to Washington State. And then Aaron Nelson. I think we see a little bit of rotation here. But Cedric Byrd, Deontay Burnett, and Justin Smith should be your top 3 receivers. Justin Smith being the cheapest is going to pique my attention. Deontay Burnett is the most expensive. He's also received some hype from competing sites. I think I would rather just go and take the leverage with Justin Smith or Cedric Byrd here in this spot. Byrd also, he's been in these developmental leagues. He was heavily targeted, but previously dealt with injuries. So I think he's still a player that might fly a little bit under the radar. I'm going to be playing some Byrd, and this is a team I'm certainly going to be stacking, looking across all skill position players, starting with Silvers and then getting to Borghi, maybe some Aline as leverage. Byrd, Burnett, and Smith is the main players to target. Next game, we have St. Louis taking on San Antonio. This is a 2.5-point spread in favor of St. Louis. St. Louis is tied for the second highest implied team total on the board. New coaching staff, of course. We mentioned most of this coaching staff is now with Arlington. So we'll pull up the coaches here for St. Louis, the BattleHawks. They are coached by Anthony Brecht, who's a former New York Jets tight end who retired in 2004. He's mostly been coaching high school since then. And his OC is Bruce Gajewski, who's a former NFL quarterback. He most recently played for the Steelers in 2016, but has also been coaching high school. He was coaching St. Francis de Sales, which is an all-boys prep school. If any of you listeners, viewers, know anything about that offense, please let me know. Because we have no idea whatsoever what kind of offense this team is going to run. I think this is the most guesswork we have of any team whatsoever because of the lack of any sort of data we have. The one thing I'll say, which leads me to believe this team is going to be pass heavier, is they spent a ton of draft capital on pass catchers. First round pick, receiver. Second round pick, receiver. Third, tight end. Then they went running back 4, receiver 5, running back 6, and then again, tight end, receiver in 7, 8. They drafted a ton of pass catchers on this team. So I think they might lean a little pass heavier, but this is just a guess. As far as signal callers, AJ McCarron is the QB for St. Louis, and he's probably going to be your chalkiest signal caller just because he's the most talented player at the position in this league. That's reflected in price, reflected in implied team total. It's a guy that actually has played in the NFL for a while. Not to any success, but as far as comparing him to the Luis Perez's of the XFL, we might as well be talking about Patrick Mahomes. So right away, he doesn't offer a lot of running ability, but I do think he is probably the safest quarterback on the board. I think the top 2 players are probably McCarron and Silvers, just from that perspective. From there, running back, we have Brian Hill, who actually is one of the more talented players in this league. Spent a lot of time with Atlanta, but he's never been able to stick with an NFL roster for long. Kareem Walker is their second running back on the depth chart. And that's really interesting because Mateo Durant was their highest drafted running back. It turns out he's going to be the third stringer. Mateo Durant is this itty-bitty Duke running back. Pretty good pass catcher. So I don't think we see a ton of him in the run game. Maybe he's used in passing down situations specifically. And Kareem Walker went to South Alabama, if I'm not mistaken there. Again, I'm probably going to make a couple of mistakes in these player evaluations. It's literally just from memory from my time covering college football. But Brian Hill, I think, is interesting at 5,800. I think he's a decent leverage play off Jermaine Martin and Borghi, who we talked about in previous teams. And he's on a team with a good implied team total here, and they're favored. Makes some sense to me. Also, decent pass catcher in his time, not only in the pros, but in college as well. Again, we mentioned this team spent a lot of draft capital on receivers. So I think McCarron stacks are live. And if we look at who this team actually listed as their starters, we have number 1, Marcel Aitman. That makes a ton of sense. He was their number 1 draft pick and the number 2 overall draft pick in this league. He went to Oklahoma State, actually played some real life games with the Raiders. So Aitman, I think, is a player who we can potentially get some leverage on. Have not seen a lot of people talking about him. If you're just looking for an expensive pivot off your Martavis Bryants and Josh Gordons, Aitman offers some leverage. I think he projects a little bit behind them, but again, some of these guys are going to be exorbitantly owned. Darius Shepard is their listed number 2. He was their 5th round draft pick. I think it makes a ton of sense. Shepard is a guy that spent time in the NFL, played with the Packers for a bit, decent special teamer. In this league, he's going to be one of your more talented options. And this team actually has a lot of really talented receivers. Austin Prell is probably going to be a slot guy. Among the backups, they have Hakeem Butler, former Iowa State great who never panned out in the NFL. He was the first draft pick of the 4th round once upon a time. Stephen Mitchell, George Campbell, and even Gary Jennings of West Virginia are on this team. I think it is a bit of a timeshare, but the 2 players I'm more confident in are Marcel Aitman and Darius Shepard. I think Prell and Butler might rotate a little bit here, but ultimately, I'll be looking a lot at Aitman and Shepard in this matchup here, especially with a team that I think might be a little pass heavier than people think, but we will see. At tight end, Giovanni Haskins was a player they drafted in round 10. They actually drafted Jalen Smith ahead of him, but he's no longer on the roster. Not sure why. So Haskins was their highest drafted tight end. Actually, Jordan Thomas was, but Giovanni Haskins comes in right behind him. Haskins is an interesting player, played at Rutgers in a terrible offense. So I think there might actually be some untapped potential with him. He's worth a flyer at the very least. I don't actually see him on this 2,500. I think he could be worth this dome minimum. If you need it, you probably don't. But interesting passing attack nonetheless. Next, we go to San Antonio, and what a team we have here. So this is the Hines Ward team, if I'm not mistaken. Pulling up the notes right now. Yep, Hines Ward coaches. Last played for the Steelers in 2011. You guys don't need me to tell you who Hines Ward is. He most recently coached receivers for Florida Atlantic. His OC is Jamie Elizondo, who's a former CFL coach. He was actually the offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Vipers for a period of time in 2020. This is really hard to evaluate. Similar to like Bob Stoops, he's been all over the board with pass rate. The Vipers had a 48% pass rate, and they were 1-4 before the league dissolved. But then in 2021, he coached for the Edmonton Elks in Canada, where they had a massive pass rate. So it's tough. But when we look at this team and the composition and where they allocated their draft capital, they spent their first 2 draft picks on running backs. So I tend to think they're going to be balanced, maybe a little run heavier. We'll see. They have a pocket passer in Jack Cohn, which kind of makes me think otherwise. At the very least, we can say Jack Cohn is not going to be involved in the run game. Jack Cohn, former Wisconsin Badger, transferred to Notre Dame, actually was fairly productive in college, just doesn't offer a lot of running. With the uncertainty in the offense, I think Cohn is going to be a decent leverage play on this slate. Just not a lot of people are going to click his name. You're going to see most people out there with some combination of Silvers, McCarron, and probably Tiamu. So Cohn, I think, offers some leverage. We'll talk about stacks later. In the run game, I think we see a timeshare, but Kalen Ballage should lead this pack. Calvin Turner is injured, so we definitely will not be seeing him. But I don't think it's just Ballage by himself. They did list Ballage as the starter, but Jock Patrick was this team's number 1 draft pick, and he was the number 3 overall pick in this league. So I think this is a timeshare. I would be a little wary of both backs. Kalen Ballage would be my preference just at 4,800. He was the listed starter. Again, I'm expecting a committee. At receiver, this team did not spend a ton of draft capital. Again, we mentioned they were really prioritizing running back in the draft. And their top overall drafted receiver was Kendrick Rogers. He's actually no longer on the team. So that leaves their second drafted receiver, Jalen Tolliver, as the number 1 wide receiver. Went to Arkansas Monticello, which I'm not familiar with. So excuse me for not knowing much about Jalen Tolliver's skill set. Behind him, Travis Johnson is their wide receiver 2. He went to Montana State. And Landon Akers is their wide receiver 3. I think there's a pretty decent chance Landon Akers just jumps these guys. He's actually spent time with the LA Rams in the preseason, whereas Tolliver and Johnson are almost entirely unknown. And I wouldn't even rule out one of these backups jumping them. TJ Vasher is a player that had a pretty good college career with Texas Tech. He's also massive, like 6'5". I would not be surprised whatsoever if TJ Vasher jumps one of these guys or if we see some sort of timeshare. But if I'm ranking them, it's going to be Landon Akers number 1 just based on the pedigree in the NFL. Tolliver 2 based on draft capital. And then number 3 is Travis Johnson because of the draft capital and him as a listed starter. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bit of Vasher in this game. At tight end, Alize Mack is the listed starter over Deion Yelder. Actually, really good tight end room for this team. Both these guys have spent time in the NFL. Mack with the Dolphins. Yelder was on the Chiefs for a period of time. So pretty good tight ends here. But again, really dicey pass rate for this team. I don't know. We will see. Entirely unknown for the most part based on the coordinator bouncing all over the board, having a draft strategy that prioritized running back and a pocket passing signal caller. Again, I think stacks of this team are going to be semi-contrarian. That brings us to our last game. Seattle, the Sea Dragons, taking on the DC Defenders. This is a pick'em, and 34.5 total. That's the lowest on the board. Both these teams are right middle of the pack, as you can probably gather, just based on the pick'em nature of this contest. So let's start with Seattle. We'll pull up the coaching staff here. Jim Haslett is the coach of this team. Most recently, the Titans linebacker coach in 2020, 2021. He's a defensive-minded coach. He's failed at various levels, but as far as this league goes, he has more experience than just about everyone other than Wade Phillips. Their OC is June Jones. June Jones, architect of the air raid. He was the OC of the Houston Roughnecks in 2020. We talked about that team already. Massive pass rate, best team in the league. Passed the ball just under 66% of the time. This team does not have a tight end on the roster, suggesting June Jones is bringing this offense to the Sea Dragons. And Ben DiNucci is the quarterback. He's one of the more talented players in this league at the quarterback position. So I think we should have a lot of interest in DiNucci, especially considering, again, I think he's going to be under-owned. If I were to project this, I would say McCarron's 1, Silvers is probably 2, and then maybe DiNucci 3. It's hard to say, but we're talking about a player who played at James Madison, spent plenty of time with Dallas in the NFL, especially in preseason games, has never been really that productive. But again, who in this league has? DiNucci at least has spent time with the most talented league in the world. So I'm going to bank on that a little bit and play some Ben DiNucci. And I'll be looking at stacks. We'll talk about him their stacks in a little bit. A certain someone's going to be the most owned player on the slate in my estimation. At running back, I think this team has a really good running back roster as well. When we look at who their listed starter was, that was Morgan Ellison, which is a bit of a surprise to me. They drafted TJ Hammonds first. He's no longer with the team. They drafted Brendan Knox in the 5th round. He was their second drafted running back. Played at Marshall, if I'm not mistaken. And then they traded for Charlie Tampano, who is a tight end. He played at like Portland State or something. I forget. He was in an FCS program. And then I don't know if he was drafted, but I remember him as a prospect. So their third string back is actually a tight end, and he projects as an H-back. We'll talk about him in a little bit. Anyway, it shows that they are looking at pass catching backs for sure. Morgan Ellison at 3,600 should be a player we are looking at a ton here. And I think he's going to be a nice leverage play off of Max Borghi because we don't really have a lot of information on this backfield. It's going to be a timeshare. Brendan Knox is a bruiser. He's more of your 2-down grinder. But I think Ellison is a good leverage play. 3,600 overall is really cheap. Among the pass catchers, we briefly touched on Tampano, who's more of like an H-back. But at the top of your screen, you are seeing the one and only Josh Gordon, who I expect to be the most owned player on the slate. He's in the offense that we want to target. He has the name value that we know and love. And he led the NFL in receiving 10 years ago. Now, he couldn't even hang around the Chiefs roster this year. And that was a roster that wasn't exactly that great at wide receiver. We're talking Sky Moore, Mecole Hardman, Juju Smith-Schuster. Of course, you guys know the whole gauntlet of receivers. But Gordon should be among the most talented players in this league, if not the number one most talented player. With Gordon, I think it comes down to, do you want to eat his ownership, or do you just want to play some of the receivers behind him, which is going to be my strategy. We also have Ja'Cour Pearson listed as a starter here. Ja'Cour Pearson most recently played for Ole Miss. He's more of your little slot receiver. And then we have Blake Jackson at 3,800. I just love to take the leverage with Pearson and Jackson. And then they didn't have a listed 4th receiver as the starter, but I think it's going to be Damian Willis if I had to guess. He is formerly of the Cincinnati Bengals and Cleveland Browns. He spent some time, if I'm not mistaken, at least one of those teams. So he has some NFL pedigree. They also have Jawan Green and TJ Hammonds listed for this spot. So that explains where TJ Hammonds went, He's actually listed as a receiver on the depth chart. He plays running back for this team. Excuse the slip there. But again, I think we could definitely just gain some leverage by playing Pearson and Jackson. It's going to be a pass-heavy team across the board. And Josh Gordon is likely going to be the number one owned player on the slate. But regardless, we need pieces of this team. The offense is just too good to pass up, as we've seen in previous stints of the XFL. On the other side, we close with the DC Defenders. So this team, they have a quarterback you know and love, Jordan Tiamu from the St. Louis BattleHawks. But looking at the DC coaching staff, Reggie Barlow is the man in charge. He's most recently been the coach of Virginia State. He ended that stint in 2021. He previously coached Alabama State before that. Fred Keiss is the offensive coordinator. He was with Reggie Barlow at Alabama State. And this team looks very run-heavy. They were a very, very run-heavy team back with Alabama State, which, is some time ago at this point. But Keiss looks like that kind of player. This team only threw the ball 34% of the time with Virginia State in the most recent stint. They actually have Greg Williams as their DC, blitz-loving, bound, or whatever that scandal was in New Orleans. He's there, formerly of the Jets as well. Quarterback position for this team, they definitely prioritize quarterbacks that can run. All three of them, Jordan Tiamu, D'Eriq King, Eric Dungy, can all run. Jordan Tiamu, former St. Louis BattleHawks great, best known for going 5-7 on Ole Miss on a team that had DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, and Dawson Knox. But nonetheless, he can run, which we can't say about really any other starting quarterback in this league. Behind him, D'Eriq King, former Houston and Miami great, also really mobile. I hope they just bench Tiamu for King at some point. I've seen enough Tiamu in my life. Would love to see what D'Eriq King has, but alas, Tiamu is the listed starter. I think he's in the top 4 most owned quarterbacks. To what point, I'm not sure. Again, I think it's McCarron, Silvers, Tiamu, and then, excuse me, the name is escaping me briefly. DiNucci, sorry, there with the Sea Dragons, just because of the offense. But Tiamu arguably offers the safest floor just because of the running. I think talent-wise, it's still McCarron up at the top there, but he should definitely be in the player pool. At running back for this team, we have Abram Smith, who I think probably leads a timeshare that also consists of Raquel Armstead. As far as talent goes, Abram Smith, he was with Baylor previously. He's a converted linebacker to the position, 2-down grinder, but they don't really have a strong pass catching back on this roster. Raquel Armstead, of course, was with Jacksonville and the Jaguars, played at Temple. Artavis Pierce is an Oregon State product, spent a little bit of time with the Bears. Abram Smith is the most talented runner on this team, but I don't think it's his backfield by any means. We'll be looking at some sort of timeshare and just rolling the dice on a timeshare between these two. It's a pick'em contest, so I think both are fine for tournaments. At receiver, this team has lost a lot to injury already. So they're actually, Abram Smith was the number 1 pick in this entire draft. So I do think we see a bit of him, but not his backfield all to himself. The number 2 pick for this team was Jaquez Ezzard at receiver. So we move here. He's 7,300. I think he makes sense as the number 1 for this team. I don't think it's clear, though. He was out of Sam Houston. Behind him, they have Josh Hammond, who spent time with Florida, and Lucky Jackson, who's a Western Kentucky product. These are the 3 wide receivers on this team. I think this is a dicey quarterback situation or a receiver situation on a run-heavy team. I'm not sure I want to allocate any sort of money into any of these guys. The only thing I'll say that makes them more attractive is they have 7 on the roster, but Chad Hansen and Puka Williams are questionable for this game. So you can see that on the screen. Hansen was sick. Williams is a hamstring injury, if I'm not mistaken. That could severely limit the amount of actual pass catchers we have available to this team. So this is a situation to watch. Unfortunately, it's the last game. So my approach is probably just going to be to fade these guys and play the better passing attacks across the league. And then tight end, Ethan Wolf is listed ahead of Briley Moore. Not really much to say there. None of these pass catchers are really enticing whatsoever. But I think Abram Smith, maybe among like the top 5-6 rushers on the slate. And same thing with Tiamu, he's a top 4 quarterback. That kind of does it. I hope that was a semi-comprehensive breakdown of the slate. Again, just try to show you where they slot. I guess we could do like a really basic top 3 or 4 at each position before we get out of here, and then we'll call it a day. Please leave comments. Let me know your feedback on just the structure of the video. This is the first one. Nobody gave me any structure coming into it, so I just kind of made it up on the fly. Okay, let's go through quick, like top 3 or 4 at each position, and then we'll get out of here. So I think first at quarterback, the top 2 options for me, it's really hard to argue against Tiamu just from the floor he gives you as a runner. He's our highest projected quarterback based on that. I don't like his team whatsoever, but this is going to be a run-heavy team. Hopefully he's just involved in the pass game. I think the second safest is A.J. McCarron of St. Louis. He's just the most talented player really at the quarterback position in this entire league for the most part. 3, I'm going to put Silvers, again, just so that pass-heavy offense we're expecting from them. And then I think 4, I'm going to put DiNucci of the Sea Dragons. Again, just the pass-heavy nature of the offense. He gets the edge over some of these other signal colors. At running back, Jermaine Martin for Orlando. Again, I don't love Orlando, the Guardians. I think they're a mess. But just the injuries on their roster, they only have 2 backs, and one of them was signed again this week. I think Jermaine Martin should be 1. Max Borghi is going to be my pick as 2, pass-catching back for Houston. I think the workload is a little shaky, but he's been a bell cow back previously. 3, I'm going to say Morgan Ellison, again, for the same reason. He's really cheap at $3,600, and he gives you access to potential pass game ceiling. And 4, I'm going to say Abram Smith. I think DC is the run-heaviest team on this slate. Abram Smith was the number 1 overall pick. A tight end, I'm going to include that in receivers. If you do play a tight end, number 1's Canella. It's not close. Among the actual receivers, I think Josh Gordon is poised to be the most talented player on probably the pass-heaviest team, but he's also probably going to be like 50% owned, if not more. He's number 1 in a vacuum, but I would tread pretty carefully with him. From there, I think we do want a piece of this Houston team. I'll say Cedric Byrd, and then some combination of Martavis Bryant and Geronimo Allison are going to be 3 or 4. Now a real preference between them. And then last up, I'll say Darius Shepard. But that'll do it. Let me know in the comments. I went way longer than I thought. Sorry about that, guys. Hopefully it was serviceable. But leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Please, feedback. Anything you can possibly offer would be much appreciated as we figure out a structure for the video. And if you want to follow on Twitter, I'm at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for listening to my ramblings. We'll be back again doing this every single week. Until then, good luck. Remember, use your leverage. We truly don't know anything about this league yet. We will find out a ton. Until next week, good luck. We'll see you then.